about um, the not so dismal science. I'm Philip Seren, professor of economics at the University of Winnipeg. What I'm going to talk about today is tariffs. As you know, tariffs are in the news from time to time. The most recent story is about the desire by both Canada and the US to levy tariffs on electric vehicles coming from China. The first thing that you have to realize about tariffs is that it is a tax on imports. Historically, tariffs were perhaps the principal method for federal governments, national governments, to finance expenditures. As they added other forms or other tax bases like income, corporate taxes, and sales taxes, tariff revenue became less important. But tariffs are still a significant feature of lots of economies. And the one thing that is quite important about tariffs is that it has an effect on altering the production decisions within an economy. However, there are two separate cases that economists look at. One is tariff policy for what's called a small open economy like Canada, where the world price is given to Canada. In other words, Canada's production decisions do not influence the world price. The second is where you are a larger economy which has a significant, whose demand has a significant impact on the world price. So that would be an example of that would be the United States. So free trade has always been seen as optimal for a small open economy like Canada, whereas free trade is not necessarily optimal for a large country like the US, whose tariff policy can influence the terms of trade. By terms of trade, we just mean what's the quantity of goods you get in exchange for your goods. So, what is the classical case for free trade? Well, the argument is that if you can import a good at a lower cost, and in a sense, it's a lower opportunity cost. So, for example, suppose Canada is thinking of producing, say, television sets, and suppose it wants to introduce a TV manufacturing company. Well, then what it has to do is it has to compare the prices that they could think. If you're a retailer, you'd have to think, okay, suppose I buy it from the Canadian manufacturing company, or I import it from, whether it's Samsung or whether it's from some other country, or Korea or some other country. Now, if the retailer can have it offered for sale at a lower price, then the argument is that Canada would be better off by doing or using its resources to produce other goods. So essentially, what happened with the admittance of China to the World Trade Organization is that lots of goods, particularly manufactured goods, came in to both not only Canada and the US, but other parts of Europe at lower prices than could be produced for prices that were lower than the prices that would needed to prevail in those countries. So the argument is that okay, so what Canada and the US should do is move into other areas. In other words, contract those industries and expand other industries. Now, what happens is after those specialization in production, then trade will take place. So, for example, suppose you consider Canada producing two goods, say manufactured goods, and for all intents and purposes, we'll say services. So, as the manufacturing sector shrinks, then the service sector will expand, and Canada, if the other country is China, Canada will trade services to China in exchange for manufactured goods. And after that trade takes place, real income or national income, in other words, the value of production in the economy, will go up. So that's the classic argument for the advantages of free trade. Now, the one thing that is generally not recognized is that international trade and the reorganization of production has sector specific effects, but it also has geographic effects. So, for example, suppose the manufacturing sector is in dispersed throughout, say, an economy. So, if you look at the US, for example, there were small scale manufacturers, particularly in the Northeast, who once the World Trade Organization came in and allowed China in, that those manufacturers either shrunk in size or were reduced. Now, the story is that that labor and that capital would be freed up to move into those expanding industries. But to the extent that that labor and that capital is sector specific, in other words, it's manufacturing, uh, it's it's it is specialized in the manufacturing sector, then those resources cannot easily move to the other expanding sector. So that is really what sort of happened in lots of cases in North America and in Western Europe, is that those traditional manufacturing sectors have shrunk, but they've also been reduced in a geographic sense. So the opportunities which used to be dispersed throughout the economy in terms of geographic location have been eliminated. Now, the sectors that have expanded tend to be concentrated in cities, because cities tend to focus on service, finance related occupations. So what you had was you had a shrinking of the economy in dispersed, uh, largely semi-rural, but also smaller cities. Uh, and the employment was increased in the larger cities. And so with that, you had a concentration of labor in larger cities. So really what's supposed to happen and what free trade argues is that the winners, in other words, the sectors that are expanding and the resources that are being used in a more highly valued sector, in a sense, can compensate the losers, those sectors which are reduced. But that rarely happens. So what you see a situation where you may have increased unemployment dispersed through these what you may call medium-sized cities or small cities, and employment concentrated in larger cities. What happens then is the people who are working on those in those areas in the service sector, their incomes rise. The consumer goods that they're buying are cheaper. So those individuals are much better off after free trade, specialization in free trade. The people who are working in the rural areas whose incomes have actually fallen, they may see lower prices, but the reduction in their wages is not sufficient to give them a net gain. So you can see that really what happens is there is a distributional effect. And if you think of the last or the sort of the Trump campaign, that is really what he's arguing. Now, most people realize that when you levy tariffs, the prices to consumers will go up. And that is the traditional argument why free trade is better, because it keeps consumer prices lower. But from a political point of view, if your constituents are dispersed throughout the economy, producing who used to produce manufacturing goods, then you can see that that eliminates, or the desire to put tariffs on to try to support those smaller cities might have some political capital. The other thing that you hear about tariffs is that any tariffs go completely to, so any tariff increase, so it's a tax on imports. So for example, if the delivered price in, say, Canada was 100 and the tariff is 10%, so normally the price would go up to $110. But the extent to which the tariff leads to higher prices depends on the ability of the retailers and, well, through the supply chain, their ability to pass those prices on. In some cases, there may be some market power on the part of the purchaser or the host country that the price may not go up to 110. So, for example, Trump's argument is that uh, the tariffs have caused the selling country, particularly China, to what's called eat some of the tariff. In other words, they may lower their price from 100 to say 95, and then the price comes up to 105. So there's been a distribution of the tariff. But that is really depending on whether the country that's levying the tariff has that market power. For countries that have little market power, the price will generally go up in lockstep with the tariff. So I think the tariff issue is more than just economics. It's obviously political economy, has some political economy overtones. But in reality, I think, and economists are generally aware of these distributional effects. But I think it's easy to think that, okay, free trade is always going to lead to higher incomes, which is true for generally for an economy, but there's significant redistributional effects. And lots of the political movements that have happened, say in Britain and the U.S., what's called the alienation of these in these smaller cities and the loss of employment, is a result of these distributional effects. So I hope you found this talk interesting, and if you like it, give it a like, and if you're interested in following more of these YouTube videos, then you can subscribe. So bye for now.